So I did want to bring it back to the Hillary Clinton thing because I did have a question about that because, she said you are a Russian asset, pretty clearly. You've also had these smears against you from various, public figures in the corporate media and politicians. Have you ever considered any kind of legal action or lawsuit against any of these people?
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to be pursuing?
We'll see.
Okay.
I'm sort of exploring whether that's possible or not. Because it's not a small thing. It's
Sure.
not a small thing to have to turn your life around to fight these smears.
Right.
But to my mind, it's not just the smears we're fighting. We're really fighting a democracy that's been hijacked. And it's very important to break that stranglehold right now. So, to my mind, it's a battle worth fighting, and I'm fighting for much more than myself. But if I had my druthers, there are other ways I would rather be fighting that battle. So we'll see.
Okay.
You brought to mind, about sort of where this smear began, and I think Hillary took the smear off the charts, she made this like the headline. But where it began actually was sort of like analogous to Tulsi. It started for Tulsi right after she declared.
Yep. It was actually hours before she officially declared. NBC put out that New Knowledge report that had the information from New Knowledge, which was a company that was exposed for creating fictitious fake Russian bots in the Alabama Senate race. They had advised on this NBC report that Russia was going to be propping up her campaign, and this came out, I believe it was 6 hours before her event where she kicked off her presidential run.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm not aware of exactly the timing, but I know that they, that they happened at about the same time. And we'll come back to New Knowledge because it's worth underscoring a couple things about that.
Definitely.
But for me, it started right after I got the nomination, right after I got the Green Party nomination. Suddenly they were circulating photos and videos out of context that suggested that, they used to suggest that I was a Putin supporter, which was absolutely false. But that began right at that time, and then it accelerated. And I had been to Moscow for a media conference that included the likes of the BBC and the Canadian Broadcasting System and China TV and the largest network in India. This was a major opportunity to speak to press from all over the world. And I was there to promote my agenda of a peace offensive in the Middle East, telling Russia they should stop bombing Syria, which they had just begun. I was, in no uncertain terms critical of Russia's foreign policy at that point. I was promoting a nuclear weapons ban and a global Green New Deal. So
And you had announced all this publicly too, saying that this is why I'm going here, right?
Yes, and my remarks were on the web. I think they still are. A video of my speech at this conference. I had announced that I had this dinner afterwards and that Putin was briefly at the table. All of this was absolutely public. I had announced also that I was raising money in order to do it, because part of the smear was that my trip had been paid for and that I was in this kind of quid pro quo deal with Putin, that I was getting financial support from Putin in order to, spoil the election. And, so there's this outrageous smear that was completely false and included false information, as well as omitting all the proper context. There's a gazillion photos of Hillary whispering into the ear of Putin and vice versa at the time that Bill Clinton was paid $500,000 for a single speech to a church, a bank, for a single speech to a bank involved in the Uranium One deal that allowed a Russian-owned company to purchase 20% of U.S. uranium supply, a decision over which Hillary Clinton had substantial control. So there's shady stuff there that merits an investigation. my interaction with Putin involved sitting at a table briefly while he was there before he gave a speech in Russian, at which there were no translators.
And again, you didn't actually know that he was going to sit with you, right?
I had been told,
Okay.
and I thought, oh great, maybe I can speak to him directly about my concerns. But it was clear he was not there to speak to anybody. He was not at the table. He did, he marched in with a group of people that I thought were all his bodyguards. This was like just before his speech. He sat down at the table. No one was introduced. The guy on my left was, I thought, one of his bodyguards. It turned out it was like his chief of staff or something like that. But no one was introduced. English speakers spoke to each other. The one person near me who spoke English was a German diplomat. And I spoke to him most of the evening. He was really the only person I talked to at that table. Gorbachev was there, a few tables away. Jesse Ventura was there. The former candidate from the Justice Party.
Rocky.
Yes, Rocky Anderson was there. Any number of political and academic people involved in the peace community were there. It was a very interesting meeting and set of discussions. And so, there was a video where I discussed that in Red Square. I gave a speech thanking my supporters for having funded the trip and explaining how really interesting it was to be meeting with people from from all over the U.S. and all over the world. Ray McGovern was there, the former CIA agent, now peace advocate and security analyst. So it was a really exciting discussion. And I really wanted them to know that I, as a candidate, that the American people have more choices than just the two war parties that the media covers. So it was a great opportunity for dialogue. And that was what the first video that circulated was my thanking my supporters and reporting kind of what an exciting dialogue was going on and the strength of the peace and human rights community that was there. That was taken by a Democratic Party operative who basically used it to say that I was praising Putin's human rights.
How?
There was nothing of the kind in that video, but you know how this stuff gets used. People don't look at the contents of the video,
Sure.
They just look at the title that goes with it. So that's
Right.
how it began. Then it was the photograph that was snapped when Putin was sitting at the table, and that was used, Michael Flynn was there. At the time, he wasn't part of Trump's campaign, but he had been known as he opposed the war in Iraq, I believe, or he opposed the war on terror, I think, was his claim to fame as the head of the military military intelligence. I think he was briefly head of military intelligence. And Obama had let him go after some weeks or months. He wasn't there very long, but he had a reputation. I wasn't aware of who he was at the time. He was just a guy that had some military title, and I thought that was interesting. So when he came over to introduce himself at the table, I gave him my elevator speech about why I was there to support a peace offensive in the Middle East. And it was clear we had absolutely nothing to say to each other, and that's where the conversation ended. So he was at the table, but that photo captured him,
Right.
as well as Putin, and then the other people who were Putin's staff that all got labeled in the photo. But you didn't know that sitting there, and it was made to look like there was something nefarious and dangerous going on that I was a part of, and that's when this smear turned from Putin's supporter to colluding with Russia. And that then spilled over into an investigation by the Senate Intelligence Committee, which investigated me and the recount for being part of this collusion with Russia.
How would the recount be collusion with Russia? Doesn't make any sense.
Well, what makes sense is that the recount is the opposite
Yeah,
of collusion
exactly.
with anybody. And somehow these members of the Senate Intelligence Committee thought that the recount was a tool used by Russia to instill doubts about the election, as if daylight
It's insane.
created, daylight is the solution. Transparency is the solution to public doubt.
Right.
The way to inspire confidence
But that's
is
all.
by looking.
That's all they've done is question the integrity of the election by saying that Russia interfered in the election. They've been saying that for the last 3 years.
Yes, exactly. Which is why they should pass ranked choice voting right now. I think they did right by prioritizing paper ballots and good, rigorous audits. And that was the agenda of our recount. And that's why we are still fighting lawsuits. We're involved in an active one in Wisconsin and one that may become reactivated in Pennsylvania right now. But this has been, to push paper ballots and to be able to inspect the software for any kind of tampering. Election software has not been inspected. So when they say, oh, there's no evidence of tampering, it's because there is no evidence, period. It hasn't been inspected after the fact. So we've been continuing.
Well, it's like
this
the
lawsuit to do
DNC
that.
server, that the FBI never saw. They just
right.
got a redacted report from CrowdStrike.
Yes, and speaking of which, why wasn't Julian Assange allowed to testify for the Mueller hearings? Let's hear it from the guy himself. Let's hear it from the horse's mouth. Where did that, where did that information come from? And did the Russians provide it? They don't want him to testify. By all appearances, it looks like they're just trying to, shut him up permanently.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I think you wanted to mention something about new knowledge also.
Yeah. So you mentioned how new knowledge was used to smear Tulsi.
Right.
But the reality was new knowledge had already been exposed for, as you mentioned, creating fake Russian bots, creating a fake Russian bot
to make it
network,
look as though Russia was interfering in the Alabama Senate race when they
which
weren't.
gets down to the point. These are election meddlers. They create false flag Russian interference campaigns, but they do that in order to meddle in our elections.
Right.
And they were meddling on behalf of the Democratic candidate who didn't know about it himself, but there were Democratic Party operatives who were funding this and who were behind it. So this is outrageous that a so-called professional cybersecurity agency that is essentially a double agent. They're acting like a double agent. They're pretending to be Russians in order to serve, in this case, a Democratic Party. So they were actually stripped of their Facebook privileges. Well, at least one of their executives is barred from using Facebook because he's a crook. And they perpetrate fraud. So this is who our intelligence community is relying on and the press is relying on. They are being advised by the perpetrators of electoral fraud.
Right.
These are crooks. They should be formally investigated and and duly punished.